So I want you to just sit with a really uncomfortable thought for a second. The most dangerous people in your life, right? They aren't the strangers lurking in an alleyway.
Right.
Statistically and, psychologically, the absolute most dangerous people are the ones you've actually been taught to trust implicitly.
Exactly. The pillars of the community.
Yeah. Like, think about the people you rely on. Your family doctor, the politicians you vote for, the religious leaders who, bless your family. We are conditioned from birth to view these specific individuals as the ultimate safe harbors.
And we have to be, to a certain extent, just to function in a society.
Totally.
Yeah.
But today, we are going into a deep dive on what happens when those harbors are when they're highly engineered traps. We're looking at the deeply, deeply unsettling reality of transnational extremist sects and localized ritualistic abuse networks.
It's a very dark reality to look at.
It really is. We're talking about organizations that operate under this pristine guise of religious devotion, but in reality, they function as sophisticated, utterly sadistic criminal syndicates. And honestly, the most infuriating part of this whole thing,
The cover-ups.
the fact that high-level politicians, law enforcement agencies, entire bureaucratic systems are actively shielding these predators from justice.
Yeah, I mean, it is the complete subversion of the social contract. When the person who is, inflicting the trauma is also the person who defines your community's morality.
That's a total mindfuck.
It really is. The psychological devastation there, it doesn't just harm the victim, right?
Right.
It fundamentally annihilates their entire framework of reality. And today we're really going to break down the clinical anatomy of this abuse, the exact mechanics of coercive control, and the geopolitical friction these networks exploit to operate basically right out in the open.
Right. And before we get into the actual mechanisms of how this works, we really need to set the table here about the reality of the material today. It is heavy.
Very heavy.
To be completely blunt, we are looking at an absolute clusterfuck of institutional failure. And the trauma inflicted on these victims is just unimaginable. So we are going to be using uncompromising 18-plus adult language because the sheer gravity of these horrors kind of demands it.
You really can't sugarcoat the systematic destruction of a human being. It doesn't work.
You can't. And I also want to make something crystal clear right up front because we are going to be diving into some intensely polarized political landscapes today.
Oh, yeah. Across multiple countries.
Exactly. We'll be discussing actions involving high-profile figures on both the left and right wings across the U.S., Israel, Guatemala, Australia. And we are not taking political sides here.
Important disclaimer.
Yeah. We are strictly, impartially reporting the timeline of factual events, the clinical data, and the legal records exactly as they exist. We're looking at the architecture of the events, completely independent of whatever political ideology happens to be in the room.
Which is really the only way to genuinely understand the scope of the problem. Because the victims in these environments, they don't belong to a political party or a voting bloc when they're being brutalized.
No, of course not.
They're just children caught in this highly optimized machine that is literally designed to crush their individuality.
So let's start by shattering, I think, the biggest misconception most people have. When you hear a phrase like ritual abuse or cult, what's the immediate image that pops into your head?
A rusty cabin in the woods.
Right. You picture like social outcasts, wearing bizarre robes, living off the grid in the desert, totally severed from modern society.
The Charles Manson stereotype.
Exactly. But the clinical reality here, specifically within certain religious Zionist sectors in Israel, for example, completely detonates that stereotype. We are looking at a geographic and sociological profile that is terrifyingly normative.
And that word normative is exactly what makes this so incredibly difficult to conceptualize. To anchor this, we really have to look at a watershed moment that happened in December 2025.
Right, the ISST Conference.
Yes, the Israeli Society for Sexual Trauma Treatment and Prevention. The IST, this is a highly respected body operating directly under the umbrella of the Israeli Medical Association, and they convened Israel's first ever professional conference dedicated entirely to ritual trauma.
And they didn't do this because of some internet conspiracy theory.
No, not at all. They convened it because a serious cadre of senior Israeli psychiatrists and therapists realized they were all independently treating the exact same pathology. They had aggregated clinical data from over 50 anonymous victims, and all of it was pointing to the same localized networks.
Wait, I need to clarify this really quick, because the moment a professional medical association validates something called ritual abuse, a lot of people are going to jump straight back to the satanic panic of the 1980s.
Oh, absolutely. The daycare centers, the secret tunnels.
Yeah, which we know was this massive, entirely debunked hysteria. So how did the ISST differentiate this actual documented trauma from those old, urban legends? Like, what was their actual clinical definition?
It's a critical distinction because the satanic panic, that was largely characterized by leading questions, coerced testimonies, and just a total lack of structural evidence.
Right, it was pure panic.
Exactly. But the ISST, they were looking at empirical present-day clinical data from adult survivors who were exhibiting profound, verifiable psychiatric splitting. And their official definition of ritual abuse is chilling in its precision.
What is it?
They define it as organized, repetitive abuse involving physical, emotional, sexual, and spiritual violence carried out within the framework of structured rituals. And they noted it often utilizes religious and cultic symbols.
But there's a specific goal, right? It's not just random violence.
Oh, the core operational mechanism, the reason it's structured this way, is to achieve total totalitarian control over the victim, to deeply indoctrinate patterns of absolute submission.
Patterns of absolute submission. God, that phrase itself is just nauseating. And when we look at the people engineering these patterns, like we said, they aren't outcasts.
No. Overwhelmingly, the profiles are elite.
We're talking prominent rabbis, trusted family doctors, highly respected educators, active, influential political figures.
People you literally trust with your life.
Right. These are the guys balancing the community budget, delivering sermons, running the local medical clinics.
They hold immense, basically unassailable social capital. And the violence they perpetrate, it is not chaotic or impulsive. It's never a crime of sudden opportunity.
It's premeditated.
Highly premeditated. The clinical data reveals this highly sophisticated, structured environment. The perpetrators assume specific, rigid, pre-assigned roles within the group dynamic.
Like what?
So one individual is the designated leader of the ceremony. Another specifically handles the administration of mind-altering substances just to incapacitate the victim. Someone else operates the recording equipment.
It's functioning like a sick theatrical production from hell. You've got a director, a lighting guy, a prop master, except the play is the systematic torture of a child.
That's an alarmingly accurate analogy.
I want to look closely at the modalities of how they actually execute this, because the specific ways they engineer this course, it's designed to break a human being on multiple simultaneous levels.
Spiritual, physical, and psychological.
Right. Take the pseudo-religious indoctrination. They take sacred artifacts, items that a child is taught from birth, represent the divine, the pure, the holy, and they completely bastardize them during the assaults.
And that subversion of the sacred is a primary tool of cognitive destruction. The clinical evidence documents perpetrators using shofar.
The ram's horn. No.
Yes, the ram's horn that holds immense sacred weight during Jewish holy days. They use them as implements during severe sexual assaults. Or they utilize staffs that the children have been indoctrinated to believe hold actual, literal, mystical powers.
Oh my God.
And while this profound physical violence is occurring, the perpetrators are chanting specific religious incantations.
Wait, they're chanting while they do it.
Yeah. Yes. They are telling these children, who are sometimes as young as 3 to 5 years old, mind you, that they are inherently impure, that their souls are defective, and that this sadistic sexual abuse is a required religious rite.
Basically telling them, you need this to become holy.
Exactly. It's framed as necessary purification.
It's essentially a double bind of the soul. Because if the person torturing you represents God, then going to God for help just means going back to your torturer.
You're completely trapped.
And they reinforce that trap with manufactured guilt. They don't just abuse the child and leave it at that. They manipulate the environment so the kid genuinely believes they triggered the abuse themselves.
This is where it gets really psychologically insidious.
Right. They will deliberately force a child to commit what, in their specific theology, are apocalyptic religious sins. Like, they will force a child to eat leavened bread during the Passover holiday, which is an absolute prohibition.
Or force them to publicly violate the Sabbath. And the psychological mechanism operating there is incredibly sophisticated. By forcing the child to break deeply ingrained foundational religious laws, the child internalizes the belief that they've become wicked.
They think it's their fault.
Yes, they believe they have personally angered the divine. So the abuser steps in, not as an attacker, but framing themselves as a savior offering violent atonement.
Wow.
The child is psychologically cornered into believing they must endure the torture to redeem their own soul. The abuser basically makes the child complicit in their own psychological destruction.
And if the spiritual and physical terror wasn't enough of a cage, there is this hyper-modern, deeply cynical layer of digital extortion laid over the top of it.
The darknet aspect.
Yeah. They film this depravity. They treat the child's body as a literal commodity to be monetized online. But filming it serves an even more fucked up dual purpose within the community structure itself.
The footage is the ultimate, inescapable weapon of extortion. It's an insurance policy. It guarantees perpetual silence well into the victim's adulthood.
Because they know the tape is out there.
Right. If a survivor ever begins to process their trauma, or even consider speaking out against the perpetrators, the threat of this deeply humiliating, traumatizing footage being released to their friends, their spouse, their community, it's always hanging right over their head.
It ensures the silence of the victim and the safety of the network.
Precisely.
Okay, let me push back on something here, because this is where my brain just hits a wall trying to understand the logistics of this madness.
Go ahead.
If these perpetrators, these doctors, these rabbis, are so respected in their daily lives, if they're making life or death medical decisions in a hospital or counseling married couples, how do they compartmentalize this level of absolute depravity?
It's a great question.
I mean, how do you drug and torture a toddler on a Tuesday night and then look their parents in the eye at the grocery store on Wednesday morning and smile? How does the human brain hold those two realities?
That is the defining question of psychopathy when it operates within high-control environments.
Yeah.
Because we have a fundamental societal bias, right? We assume that monstrous acts are committed by people who look and act like monsters.
Right, the guy in the alley.
Yeah, we look for erratic behavior, social isolation. But sociopathic architecture allows these individuals to completely disconnect their public persona from their private sadism.
They just flip a switch.
Sort of. In many of these cultic networks, the perpetrators possess a malignant narcissism where they truly believe their own twisted theology. They view themselves as this enlightened, untouchable elite performing a necessary cosmic function.
So they don't even feel guilty.
The compartmentalization isn't a struggle for them at all. It's a core feature of their pathology. They do not view the child as a human being with agency or a soul.
What do they see them as?
Merely a vessel, an object, a prop utilized to fulfill their own delusions of grandeur and power.
So they don't feel the dissonance because they just don't view the victim as human. That brings us directly into the mechanics of how they actually break the psyche of the victims. Because a child cannot just casually endure this. Their brain has to fundamentally alter its own structure just to survive the environment.
It really does.
Let's look at Lev Tahor. This is a transnational sect founded by a man named Shlomo Hellbrands in the 1980s. International observers and critics often refer to them derogatorily as the Jewish Taliban because of their extremism.
And Lev Tahor is the paradigmatic example of a group utilizing absolute, multidimensional isolation to systematically eradicate individual identity.
It's total lockdown.
Coercive control isn't just about physical boundaries. It's about linguistic, intellectual, and psychological severance from the entire outside world.
And they begin this eradication before the child even has a chance to form an ego. We're talking about forcing girls as young as 3 years old into head-to-toe black coverings, essentially burqas.
That's 3 years old.
Think about that mechanism. You are putting a toddler in a sensory deprivation suit. You are obliterating her physical identity before she even knows what a mirror is. It's horrifying.
And the educational isolation is just as weaponized. Back in 2013, when Quebec Social Services investigated Lev Tahor in Canada, the physical conditions were horrifying: urine-soaked mattresses, severe untreated fungal infections.
But the psychological conditions were arguably worse.
Yeah, they found teenagers who could not do basic addition, kids who had been born and raised in Canada but did not speak a single word of English or French.
Because educational deprivation is a highly calculated, incredibly effective weapon. By strictly banning secular education, the sect leadership guarantees total intellectual and practical dependency.
Where are you going to go if you can't read a street sign?
Exactly. Imagine being a teenager and left to whore. Suppose you possess the cognitive resilience to realize that the environment is abusive. How do you actually escape?
You can't. You don't speak the language of the country you live in. You don't understand the concept of fiat currency. You have zero geographical awareness. The leadership engineers the environment so that the prospect of navigating the unknown outside world is genuinely more terrifying than the familiar abuse inside the compound.
They literally build a prison out of ignorance. But then you have localized versions of this terror, which are almost more disturbing to me because they don't happen in isolated compounds in the jungle. They happen in suburban living rooms.
Like the Elior Chen case.
Yes, the Elior Chen purification cult that operated in Jerusalem in the mid-2000s. Elior Chen was this self-proclaimed rabbi who managed to convince his followers that their own children were possessed by demons.
A classic cult framing.
But what I really want to understand is the mechanism of proxy abuse here. Chen manipulated a mother who's identified in the court records simply as M into separating from her husband and allowing Chen's disciples to turn her own home into a localized torture cell.
Her own children.
Yeah. How do you hijack maternal instinct so completely that a mother allows her kids to be tortured?
Well, the Elior Chen case is a masterclass in the mechanics of proxy abuse and psychological dominance. Because Chen rarely dirtied his own hands.
He just gave you orders.
He operated as the unquestioned theological architect. And to break a mother's instinct, you have to completely reframe her reality.
Yeah.
Chen convinced his followers that the physical body was irrelevant compared to the eternal soul.
Okay.
And he claimed that the children's souls were actively harboring demonic entities that threatened the entire community.
So it's life or death to them.
Yes. Once a parent accepts that premise, that the child is a literal demonic threat, the abuse is reframed as a desperate, loving exorcism. And the reality of what occurred in that home is viscerally difficult to process. The normalization of violence escalated to just unimaginable degrees.
The details are beyond nightmare territory. We are talking about a network of adults who forced a child against an active electric heater, holding him down until his flesh burned to the 3rd degree.
And that wasn't even the end of it.
No. Because that physical trauma wasn't sufficient for their purification, they poured alcohol over the burns and violently rubbed salt into the raw flesh while the child screamed.
It's pure sadism masquerading as faith.
They would tape a child's mouth shut, but only after stuffing a skull cap inside it so the kid was constantly choking. They systematically forced the children to eat human feces to break their basic biological dignity.
To completely degrade them.
And the horrific culmination of this localized cell was a 3-year-old boy being shaken and beaten with such ferocity that the resulting brain damage left him in a permanent, irreversible vegetative state.
The 3-year-old. And within that environment of absolute normalized terror, we see the deployment of one of the most insidious psychological weapons imaginable.
Forced complicity.
Yes. The environment normalizes the violence to the point where family units are weaponized against themselves. Siblings are not just forced to witness the torture of their brothers and sisters, they are forced by the adults to actively participate in it.
Which takes us to the absolute darkest application of forced complicity. Using it as a weapon against the state itself.
The Guatemala raid.
Exactly. Fast forward to December 2024. The Guatemalan government, operating with intelligence backing from Homeland Security, executes this massive tactical raid on the Lev Tahor compound in Oratorio.
And they successfully rescue 160 minors.
Right. But the true horror actually unfolds in the state-run shelters after the raid. Because the adult cult members, who were detained alongside them, started issuing orders to the children in Yiddish.
Yeah. The adult handlers recognized that their physical control was severed, so they activated the psychological programming.
Like a sleeper agent protocol.
Very much so. They shouted explicit, aggressive directives to the children in Yiddish, a language the Guatemalan social workers obviously couldn't understand.
Right.
They commanded the minors to violently struggle with the police and to actively attack the very people who had just rescued them.
And the kids just did it.
The children, whose entire reality had been engineered to view the outside world as a literal, demonic threat to their souls, obeyed with terrifying absolute zeal.
God.
Over the course of several nights in the shelters, these deeply indoctrinated youths rioted. They destroyed state property, smashed the windows of the facility, and then picked up the broken shards of glass and used them as weapons to attack the police officers and government personnel.
I want to just think about the mechanics of what is happening in that child's mind for a second. When you force a traumatized kid to pick up a piece of broken glass and try to stab the police officer who just pulled them out of a cult, aren't you essentially murdering their moral compass?
You are.
You are forcing them to become the monster they're running from. How does a human brain ever recover from being forced into that level of profound moral contradiction?
You're touching on the exact clinical reality of profound, complex trauma here. Because the brain doesn't just process that level of contradiction. It can't.
That's too much.
Way too much.
Mm.
To survive an environment where you are subjected to mind-altering drugs, electrical shocks, sexual torture, and then forced to participate in extreme violence, a child's brain cannot remain a single cohesive unit.
What happens to it?
It would literally shut down from the sheer psychological force. So it must splinter to survive. And this is exactly where we see the clinical development of dissociative identity disorder, or DID.
I really want to spend some time on DID here, because the moment you say dissociative identity disorder, a huge portion of the public instantly defaults to Hollywood tropes.
Multiple personalities trope.
Right. They picture a cheesy movie with a character changing outfits and doing different voices. They think it sounds fabricated. So how does DID actually function as a biological survival mechanism in these specific high-control environments?
The Hollywood caricature of DID is actually a highly dangerous misconception, and it's one that abusers heavily rely upon to discredit their victims.
Because it makes the victims sound crazy.
Exactly. But in cases of organized, sadistic ritual abuse, the trauma is so overwhelmingly extreme and so entirely contradictory to the basic mammalian drive for survival that the developing brain performs a radical act of compartmentalization.
Like breaking itself into pieces.
It literally creates amnesic barriers, firewalls within the neural pathways. This psychological splitting allows one fragmented part of the child's psyche to maintain a facade of normative functioning.
So they can still go to school.
Yes. That part can sit at the dinner table, focus on a math problem, or attend a synagogue service without screaming. Meanwhile, another, entirely walled-off part of the psyche holds the somatic memory, the physical pain, and the absolute terror of the abuse. So when clinicians evaluate survivors and diagnose complex AD, it is not evidence that the victim is delusional, lying, or easily suggestible.
It's proof they survived.
Clinically speaking, DD is the exact, expected, predictable blueprint of a brain that has successfully survived this highly specific architecture of psychological hell.
So the brain is essentially building its own panic rooms just to keep the heart beating.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
It is an incredible biological miracle that they survive at all, but the cost is this completely fractured existence. Which brings us to the aspect of this reality that makes my blood absolutely boil. The architecture of impunity.
How they get away with it.
Exactly. How is it that these monsters don't just get away with this for a weekend or a month, but for entire decades? These networks do not survive simply because they find a good hiding spot in a jungle.
No, they're much more embedded than that.
They survive because they have integrated themselves into a massive system of high-level enablers. So we need to look at the three distinct typologies of institutional complicity, and we are going to start with the political and electoral shielding.
Okay, so the concept of political shielding is perfectly illustrated by the trajectory of Shlomo Hellbrands, the founder of Left Tahor.
Right.
To understand how he built a transnational empire, we have to look at his operations in Brooklyn, New York in 1994. Hellbrands was convicted of kidnapping a 13-year-old Israeli boy who had been sent to his compound for bar mitzvah tutoring.
He just took the kid.
He took him. The justice system functioned as it should initially, though. Hellbrands was tried, convicted, and sentenced to state prison. He was a convicted child kidnapper, completely unremorseful, and flagged as a deportable alien.
By all metrics, that should have been the end of his operation. He's in a cell.
Should have been.
But he barely unpacks his bags in prison. After serving just 2 years, the New York State Parole Board grants him a highly irregular, incredibly controversial early release.
Unprecedented, really.
Yeah, and it took a massive federal probe by the U.S. Attorney's Office into the administration of then-Governor George Pataki to reveal the mechanics of how a convicted cult leader essentially buys his way out of a cell.
And we should pause here for a second.
Right, exactly. Just to be crystal clear here, because we are talking about the New York political machine of the 1990s, our focus is not on taking political sides regarding the Pataki administration, the Republican Party, or the Democratic Party.
No, we're just looking at the mechanics.
We are strictly looking at the timeline of the federal corruption investigation and how campaign finance loopholes were exploited according to the historical records, period.
And what that federal investigation uncovered is a textbook example of how a state's criminal justice apparatus can be deeply compromised. They looked at the sheer gravity of campaign finance pressures and the highly organized mobilization of block voting.
How'd it work?
The probe centered on a highly influential political fundraiser within the Satmar Hasidic community, a man named Rabbi Leon Perlmutter. Perlmutter had allegedly orchestrated the generation of substantial, crucial campaign funds for the governor's election.
Lots of cash.
Lots of cash and votes. In exchange for this massive financial support and his ability to deliver a monolithic voting bloc, Perlmutter allegedly secured highly favorable back-channel treatment for convicted felons within his sphere of influence.
So he called in a favor.
He successfully lobbied the parole board, leveraging that political capital to secure Hellbrun's early release.
It is the ultimate transactional perversion of justice. You trade a massive pyre of campaign cash and the guarantee of a mobilized voting bloc, and the state politely hands you back a convicted child kidnapper so he can cross international borders and go on to build a massive empire of systemic abuse.
It's a horrific trade.
But politicians aren't the only ones running interference. What happens when the political shielding fails and a foreign state actually authorizes a raid? The cults still have a backup plan. They just buy the cops on the ground.
The second typology.
Yes, direct law enforcement corruption. We just talked about that massive December 2024 raid on Left to Whore in Guatemala. But what most people don't know is that the authorities actually attempted to breach that compound several times previously and failed completely. Why? Because the cult was entirely prepared for them?
They were prepared because they had infiltrated the state's security apparatus.
How high up?
High up. An internal investigation conducted by the Guatemalan Public Prosecutor's Office uncovered that a deputy commissioner of the National Civil Police was actively, illegally collaborating with the Left to Whore leadership.
A deputy commissioner.
Yes, this was a high-ranking official who was taking highly sensitive, heavily classified tactical raid intelligence and leaking it directly to the cult.
He sold out 160 children.
He did.
He provided the abusers with the exact operational timeline they needed to hide the most vulnerable children, to destroy digital evidence, to wipe their servers, and to meticulously orchestrate that violent Yiddish-directed riot we discussed earlier.
He basically gave them the playbook.
And if political lobbying and dirty cops aren't enough, we arrive at the third typology, which is perhaps the most sophisticated and maddening of all: bureaucratic sabotage. And there is no clearer example of this than the Malka Leifer case.
The Malka Leifer case is astounding. She was the principal of an ultra-Orthodox girls' school in Melbourne, Australia. In 2008, literally moments before the Australian police were mobilizing to arrest her on 70 severe charges of child rape and sexual assault, she was tipped off and fled to Israel.
70 charges.
70. What should have been a standard international extradition treaty process devolved into a grueling, deeply traumatic 15-year battle.
15 years.
For an extradition.
Yes. And the delay was not caused by a slow judiciary. It was caused by active criminal interference orchestrated at the highest cabinet levels of the Israeli government. And again, let's seamlessly apply our impartiality standard here. We are now discussing Israeli politics and high-level government ministers. We are taking absolutely no political side regarding the Israeli government, its coalitions, or any specific political party. We are simply reporting the documented legal facts of the Malka Leifer extradition interference.
Absolutely. So the interference was spearheaded by the Israeli deputy health minister at the time, Yaakov Litzman. Litzman utilized the immense centralized power of his governmental office to systematically, illegally pressure state-employed psychiatrists.
What, he was threatening the doctor?
He actively summoned these medical professionals to his office and applied intense pressure, demanding that they falsify Malka Leifer's psychiatric evaluations.
Oh my God.
He forced the medical bureaucracy to declare her mentally unfit to stand trial, thereby legally freezing her extradition to Australia for years.
He weaponized the entire psychiatric and medical bureaucracy of a sovereign nation to build a shield for a predator facing 70 charges of child rape.
She did.
He essentially turned the Ministry of Health into a defense firm for a fugitive. And when the system finally caught up to him, when he was finally indicted for breach of trust and obstructing justice, what was the mechanism of his accountability? Did he spend years in prison for obstructing an international pedophile investigation?
No, he did not.
No. He signed a comfortable plea deal, received a suspended sentence, and paid a pathetic fine of roughly $940 US.
$940.
A $940 fine. Are you kidding me? For protecting someone with 70 rape charges.
When you look at these three typologies together, the parole boards, the police leaks, the falsified psychiatric evaluations, it reveals a terrifying structural truth about how these organizations function.
Their business.
Cults do not merely rely on theological brainwashing to maintain their power. They survive by treating institutional corruption as a standard line item in their operational budget.
Wow.
They actively, intelligently exploit the jurisdictional friction of international borders, the immense greed of elected politicians, and the inherent vulnerabilities of state bureaucratic systems.
It makes the entire justice system look like a corrupt VIP bouncer at a high-end club. You know exactly the dynamic, letting the absolute worst, most violent predators walk right through the velvet rope, completely bypassing the massive line of desperate victims.
Just because they can pay?
Yeah, simply because the predator brought a bag of cash or a block of votes, or because they happen to belong to the correct political party. It is a completely rigged game.
It is.
And to truly understand the lethal, devastating consequences of this rigged game, we have to bring this systemic failure down to a deeply personal, human level. We need to look at one of the most heartbreaking stories in this entire landscape, the tragedy of Shoshana Strook.
Shoshana's life and death lay bare the absolute lethal intersection of political power, judicial suppression, and the total devastation of a victim's psyche.
It really does.
Her story removes the abstract nature of systemic failure and forces us to look at what happens to a human being when the state decides their trauma is politically inconvenient.
So let's talk about Shoshana. She was born in 1987. She was the eldest of 11 children raised in a hardline religious Zionist settlement in Hebron. And we cannot talk about her story without understanding her lineage, because her lineage is the entire driving force behind the cover-up.
The political connections.
Right. Her mother is Orit Strook, a highly influential, powerful politician, a leading figure in the religious Zionist party, and the sitting Minister of Settlements and National Missions in the Israeli government.
Very powerful.
Very. Now, for the vast majority of Shoshana's life, she suffered from inexplicable, agonizing psychological distress. She battled severe clinical depression, survived multiple suicide attempts, and experienced profound, debilitating dissociative amnesia regarding her childhood.
The amnesic firewalls we talked about earlier.
Exactly. She had massive blocks of missing time. She was in so much pain and so desperate for answers that she actually studied cognitive psychology at the university level just to try and understand the fracturing of her own mind.
She was trying to heal herself.
Yeah.
And the tragic reality of dissociative amnesia is that the firewalls eventually degrade. It wasn't until Shoshana was 28 years old, during a trip to Australia, that she encountered a specific, severe traumatic trigger.
What happened?
This trigger effectively shattered her amnesic barriers. She didn't just remember things in a narrative sense. She experienced a violent, overwhelming flood of somatic memories. Intense, unexplainable physical sensations paired with hyper-specific visual fragments of locations within her childhood home.
God, that sounds terrifying.
It was through this agonizing process that she realized she had been subjected to ongoing, organized, ritualistic sexual abuse.
And when she finally possessed the vocabulary and the memories to speak out in early 2025, the allegations she leveled were earth-shattering. She formally accused her own parents, including sitting Minister Orit Strook and her maternal grandfather, of subjecting her to highly organized ritual abuse starting when she was just 2.5 years old.
2.5.
Yeah. She alleged that her father actively trafficked her to organize pedophile ceremonies in Tel Aviv and filmed the abuse. Furthermore, she alleged that she was forced to undergo incredibly sadistic, violent conversion therapy, directed by her father and Rabbi Zvi Thau, a massively influential spiritual leader, specifically designed to erase her lesbian identity.
And we need to pause here for the standard.
Yes, I will insert our impartiality standard right here once more. We are discussing incredibly severe allegations leveled against a sitting government minister and prominent national religious figures. We are taking absolutely no political stance. We are recounting the legal trajectory and historical progression of Shoshana Strook's allegations exactly as they are documented.
And what is vital to analyze here is the precise mechanism of how the state responded to those allegations. When Shoshana navigated the immense trauma required to file a formal criminal complaint, the Israeli justice system did not mobilize to protect a highly vulnerable victim.
What did they do?
Instead, the apparatus of the state reacted by issuing one of the most sweeping, draconian judicial gag orders in modern legal memory.
A gag order.
This order completely forbade the press from publishing the names of the accused or any specific details of her allegations. It was a total legal blackout.
The judge presiding over this, Menachem Mizrahi, upheld the gag order by notoriously stating that the suspicion was extremely meager. Meanwhile, the police completely suspended the criminal investigation, citing a lack of evidence.
Which is absurd when you look at the process.
It's totally absurd, because here is the mechanism of the cover-up that defies all logic. They suspended the investigation without ever even bothering to formally interrogate her parents.
They didn't even ask them.
How in the hell does a law enforcement agency investigate a complex, multi-year abuse syndicate without actually questioning the primary suspects named in the complaint?
They don't. That's the point.
Right. And to make the bureaucratic sabotage even clearer, the historical record indicates that Attorney General Gali Baharov-Miara had planned to release an official public statement regarding the lack of evidence to close the matter, but that statement was allegedly blocked directly by the intervention of Minister Orestrik.
The psychological weight of that gag order cannot be overstated. It was so ironclad, so deeply suppressing, that when the Israeli Knesset finally held those harrowing parliamentary hearings on the reality of ritual abuse in June 2025, Shoshana bravely attended alongside other survivors.
She was there in the room.
She was physically sitting in the halls of power. But because of the gag order, she was legally prohibited from testifying about the realities of her own life. She was actively silenced by the very state she was desperately begging for intervention.
The psychological toll of being structurally gaslit by your family and your government was absolute. Shoshana developed complex DD. She ended up homeless, living on the streets, because she was absolutely terrified that her family would use their immense influence to force her into a locked psychiatric institution simply to silence her.
A very valid fear.
Very valid. In December 2025, she posted a chilling prophetic warning online. She wrote, "If they tell you that I committed suicide or was hurt in an accident, do not believe it."
Wow.
Just 3 months after posting that, in March 2026, Shoshana Struck was found dead at the age of 38. The police, acting with incredible speed, instantly ruled out foul play.
Conveniently.
Yeah, and that ironclad draconian gag order. It remains in full effect to this day, permanently suppressing the details of her life, her death, and her allegations.
What we are witnessing in Shoshana's tragedy, and in the patterns of so many other survivors, is the highly calculated weaponization of the psychiatric establishment.
PR speak.
Exactly. Following her death, her family and their allies engaged in a concerted public relations campaign claiming she had suffered from severe schizophrenia.
Did she?
No. Her attorney vehemently fought this, proving it false by providing clear documentation from the state attorney's office showing she had absolutely no such diagnosis and was not classified as suicidal.
It was a lie.
But you have to understand why the abusers used this specific tactic. Publicly labeling a victim delusional or schizophrenic is the ultimate impenetrable public relations defense.
Because it invalidates everything they say.
Exactly. It instantly invalidates the victim's entire lived reality, and crucially, it absolves the powerful institutions of any legal or moral requirement to investigate their own ranks.
It is a perfectly sealed, inescapable loop of bullshit. Think about the mechanics of the trap here. The justice system demands empirical proof of the trauma, but then that same system slaps a gag order on the victim so they legally cannot speak to gather corroborating witnesses. Then the police conveniently refuse to interrogate the suspects because they hold too much political capital. And finally, the family labels the victim legally insane to completely discredit the memories. It is a rigged game from top to bottom.
It's impenetrable.
How does a society even begin to break this cycle? Especially when the horrors are happening right under people's noses in suburban neighborhoods. This brings us to the massive paradigm shift that happened with the Can 11 documentary that aired in May 2026. This was the moment the dam finally broke in Israel.
The Can 11 investigation, spearheaded by journalists Roni Zinger and Chen Lieberman, was utterly devastating because it completely localized the horror.
It brought it home.
It removed the comfortable distance of a transnational cult operating in a distant jungle. It focused directly on the normative religious Zionist settlements in Gush Etzion. The documentary broadcast the highly detailed, corroborated testimonies of 5 distinct women who had never met each other, yet who all described virtually identical, highly specific patterns of ritualistic use occurring in the exact same geographic zones.
And they named places. They identified a local nagaria, a carpentry shop within the settlement. One mother agonizingly recounted how her daughter was systematically abused there by a group of 6 local men who assaulted her, with each man playing a strict pre-assigned role, as they described it, like in a play.
It's like we talked about earlier.
Yeah. And when that terrified mother went directly to the settlement heads and the local rabbis, armed with the names of the perpetrators, she was completely stonewalled. The police quietly closed the case, citing a lack of evidence.
Of course they did.
The documentary also exposed a highly prominent family doctor who was independently implicated by at least 7 different women for systematically injecting them with mind-altering substances during these localized cult ceremonies. He was formally indicted, but the presiding judge actually acquitted him.
Because of his status.
Right. Why did he acquit him? Because the judge explicitly deemed it illogical that an elite, highly educated, socially respected man would engage in such heinous acts.
That specific judicial bias is staggering, and it reveals exactly how the architecture of impunity functions on a localized communal level.
It's literally written into the rulings.
The judge is essentially codifying the belief that high social status and professional repute are intrinsic legal proof of innocence. It relies on a profound structural cognitive dissonance within both the community and the judiciary, a literal psychological inability to reconcile the pristine image of a pillar of the community with the hidden reality of a sadistic predator.
Which perfectly transitions us to the ideological crisis this entire reality has generated. This is a concept that is going to deeply resonate with anyone who has ever been part of a tight-knit community, whether that's a church congregation, a massive corporate culture, or even a deeply enmeshed family unit.
Because we all protect our groups.
Yeah, when the justice system is this thoroughly compromised by corruption and bias, the only defense the society has left is the community itself. But as we saw when the Can 11 documentary dropped, the community's first instinct wasn't to protect the victims. It was to protect the brand.
The immediate backlash.
We have to examine the rabbinical establishment's reaction and the battle between acknowledging facts versus hiding behind dangerous fictions. Because the initial reaction from the leadership was an aggressive, highly coordinated campaign of pathological denial.
Yes. Prominent religious figures and community leaders immediately went on the offensive, categorizing the survivor testimonies as a localized manifestation of satanic panic.
Using that exact phrase.
Deliberately trying to draw parallels to the debunked hysteria in the U.S. to invalidate the clinical data. They blamed false memory syndrome. They claimed the entire documentary was a coordinated, left-wing political defamation campaign designed specifically to attack and dismantle the religious nationalist community.
It was a textbook, immediate deployment of institutional self-preservation.
Absolutely.
But the silence finally broke from the inside. In January 2026, Rabbi Yaakov Madan, who is a highly respected, deeply influential leader within Gush Etzion, released a video that completely stunned the religious world.
A huge moment.
He broke ranks and confirmed that the abuse was absolutely real. He stated that he had personally received clear, undeniable testimonies from the parents of the victims. He looked into the camera and warned his own congregation that the monsters were not outsiders. They were embedded in daily community life, actively praying right next to them in the synagogue.
And in doing so, he coined a sociological term that I think is the master key to understanding this entire deep dive.
Social narcissism.
Yes, social narcissism. It is an incredibly profound, piercing sociological diagnosis.
What does it mean exactly?
Rabbi Madan defined social narcissism as the deeply toxic, overarching desire of a collective group to view its own community as perfectly pure, beautiful, and clean.
We're the good guys.
Exactly. This overwhelming need to maintain a pristine self-image directly leads the community to actively ignore, suppress, or outright deny horrific internal crimes. The community becomes so obsessed with its own reflection that it will sacrifice its own members to protect the mirror. He warned that the ultimate cost of this communal denial is always, inevitably, borne by the bodies and minds of the children.
Social narcissism is essentially communal gaslighting on an industrial scale. It is a mechanism where the community prioritizes the preservation of the brand over the actual blood of the vulnerable.
Yes.
And Rabbi Madan's intervention was the critical watershed moment. By naming the pathology, he broke the cognitive dissonance. It led directly to the unprecedented May 2026 admission of guilt by the Gush Etzion Regional Council, where the leadership finally, officially acknowledged that systematic, localized, ritualistic sexual abuse had genuinely occurred within their borders.
But as this horrific truth finally comes to light, we have an immense responsibility to make an absolute, unambiguous distinction here.
We have to. We have to separate the empirical reality of these cults from historical hatred. We have to talk about the blood libel.
This is a vital, non-negotiable criminological and ethical distinction.
What is the blood libel?
The blood libel is an ancient, deeply racist, virulent anti-Semitic myth that originated in the Middle Ages. It is a fabricated conspiracy theory that falsely claims Jewish people murder outsiders, specifically Christian children, to harvest their blood for use in religious rituals.
Which is just insanity.
It is a completely baseless, psychotic myth that has been historically weaponized to justify mass persecution, violent expulsions, and systemic genocide. It was most notably utilized by the Nazi regime, and it continues to circulate in the darkest corners of the internet today.
And we must be incredibly crystal clear here. The documented, factual, clinically verified cult abuses we are dissecting today have absolutely zero connection to that racist myth.
Yeah.
The monsters operating left to horror, the sadistic architects of the Ilir Chen network, these localized cells in the settlements, they're not attacking outsiders. They are torturing their own children. They are systematically abusing their own deeply devoted followers as a mechanism to enforce totalitarian psychological control. And they are executing these horrors in direct, flagrant, blasphemous violation of mainstream Jewish law.
Which explicitly holds the preservation of human life and the absolute safety of children as the highest possible mandates, superseding almost all other religious obligations.
Exactly.
Conflating the empirical, tragic reality of high-control cult abuse with ancient anti-Semitic tropes is not merely a sign of historical ignorance, it is an actively dangerous failure of logic.
Because it helps the abusers.
It obviously feeds global bigotry.
Right.
But more importantly for our context, it provides the actual real-world cult leaders with the perfect impenetrable cover.
Right.
When a high-control group like Lev Tahor is legitimately raided by state child protective services, the leadership immediately runs to the international press and claims they are simply the victims of religious persecution or anti-Semitic targeting. If society allows real, documented crimes against children to be confused with fake, racist myths, we are actively handing the abusers a highly effective geopolitical shield.
Which brings us to the ultimate paradox of this entire nightmare. If social narcissism acts as communal gaslighting, and the abusers are brilliantly hiding behind the shield of fake religious persecution while actively torturing their own congregations, how do the everyday, genuinely faithful people living in these communities reconcile their existence?
It's an existential crisis.
When the veil drops and you realize that the monsters aren't hiding in the woods but are actually the ones leading the prayers and teaching your children, how do you keep believing in anything sacred?
It forces an incredibly profound, often destabilizing theological and psychological reckoning. For many survivors and community members, it requires the agonizing process of completely separating the concepts of the divine from the deeply flawed, corrupt human institutions that falsely claim to represent it.
You have to separate God from the church, basically.
Exactly. It demands a realization that genuine faith and genuine morality must forcefully prioritize the protection of the vulnerable, the actual physical preservation of life over the reputation, the funding, or the public relations of the institution.
Right.
When community leaders finally admit fault, as they did in Gush Etzion, it begins the slow process of dismantling that cognitive dissonance. But the untangling of that web is a deeply painful, multi-generational trauma.
We have covered a massive, incredibly heavy expanse of ground today. We started by looking straight at the clinical reality, shattering the comfortable myth of the fringe cabin in the woods, and exposing the prominent elite figures who utilize pseudo-religious terror to psychologically annihilate children.
We looked at the mechanics of the trauma itself.
Right. We broke down how they shatter the psyche, looking at the horrors of left to horror, forcing 3-year-olds into sensory deprivation Merkas and Ilir Chen's localized suburban torture cells. We saw the absolute soul-crushing tragedy of forced complicity, where deeply brainwashed children in Guatemalan shelters were ordered in Yiddish to violently attack the very people trying to rescue them.
And we mapped the incredibly complex architecture of impunity.
The cover-ups.
Right, we examined the precise mechanisms of how Shlomo Hellbrenz bought his freedom through mobilized political campaign finance in New York, how corrupt Guatemalan police leaked classified tactical intelligence to protect a cult, and how an Israeli minister actively falsified psychiatric evaluations to build a shield for Malka Leifer.
And we witnessed the devastating, irreversible human cost of this systemic bureaucratic corruption through the tragic life and death of Shoshana Struck, whose voice was crushed by the combined weight of familial political power and draconian judicial gag orders.
The system failed her completely.
And we ended by looking at the ideological reckoning, the war between the cowardly, self-serving denial of satanic panic and the immense courage it takes to actively confront social narcissism. The truth of what is happening in these high-control environments is finally, slowly piercing the veil, But the structural shields, the corrupt politicians, the sweeping gag orders, the deep institutional rot, they are still heavily aggressively entrenched.
There's still a lot of work to do.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a thought that I hope lingers long after you finish listening. We have spent this entire time dissecting extreme sects, transnational cults, and incredibly powerful political dynasties.
But it's not just about them.
Exactly. I want you to pull the lens back and look closely at your own world. Think about the institutions that anchor your life. Your local school board, your municipal government, your community organizations, the company you work for, or your church. When a credible scandal threatens the pristine good name of an institution you love, what is their immediate reflexive instinct? Is it to fiercely, transparently, and aggressively protect the vulnerable at all costs? Or is it to quietly circle the wagons, hire crisis managers, hide the truth, and protect the brand?
It is the most critical question a society can ask itself. True accountability and true safety absolutely cannot exist in any environment that values its own reflection over the reality of its actions.
Because the precise moment that public relations becomes more important than a human being's safety, the concrete foundation for this exact kind of nightmare has already been poured.
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us on this intense journey today. We know the material was incredibly heavy, but choosing to look away only ever protects the predators. Stay relentlessly curious, always trust your instincts, and never ever stop questioning the systems of power operating around you.